Hello friends. Now let me start this particular discussion by a quote which says that every problem is actually an opportunity in disguise. To put it in context, in your pre-INI CET era, in the few days prior to your INI CET exam, most of you were, conceiving this particular exam as being a big problem because it was a new exam which was going to be conducted in a new unknown format, right? And therefore we always have a fear of, change or fear of the unknown, and therefore we were all, looking at this exam as a new kind of a problem. But believe it or not, it was actually a very, very big opportunity. Rather than giving 4 different exams at 4 different centers with different formats, investing a lot of time in preparing for these particular different types of exams, traveling to different centers, appearing for them, going for their independent counselings in this crucial period of time, the best gift probably you could have is that all these exams were combined together in one, and that is what you had in the form of INI CET. For those of you who have cracked this, particularly this particular exam, for those particularly, the problem is solved, they would probably get a good seat, and go ahead. But for those of you who are still planning to prepare for your NEET PG entrance exam, believe me, now again, not getting a very good rank in this particular exam, you might perceive this as a problem or a disadvantage, right? You might be judging yourself with the kind of score or the kind of rank that you got in this particular exam. Believe me, at this particular point itself, we thought that we need to reach out to our students and try to convert this particular problem into an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to improve. So you thought, you were probably disappointed as to you did not get a great rank in this particular exam. No problem, the exam is gone, it is the past now. I want you to focus more on the present and the upcoming, NEET PG entrance exam, and therefore we are going to have a very concise discussion of the topics which were asked, the questions which were asked in your INI CET. In doing so, we will be revising important topics targeted, for your NEET PG entrance exam. There are a lot of high yield topics which are going to be discussed here today. Another, gift that you have received probably, and I look at it positively, is that you've got some additional time to prepare for your NEET PG entrance exam. The letter which has leaked out has said that probably your exam is going to be postponed. So you've got some additional time to prepare as well. We are also going to discuss on what is the best strategies in which you can utilize this time to the maximum extent. So why this particular video? Yes, the main purpose of doing this video is to reach out to you and to bring you back on track. We've realized that most of the students have a slightly laid back approach now that the NEET PG postponement has been announced, right? But that is not the right thing to do. In fact, you must, try to use this whatever additional time that you have got to the maximum extent and convert it positively into strengthening your preparation. And that is what we are trying to do out here. By looking at these videos, when you watch one subject after the other, you are revising important things, you're coming back on track, you're coming into the mahole, if I may say, of preparing for this particular NEET PG exam. We're going to have a concise discussion of INI CET important questions and important related topics as well, right? And we are also going to discuss what to do next in the countdown towards your NEET PG entrance exam. So are you ready? Are you all geared up? So sit back, relax, enjoy this particular discussion. It is going to be a fun discussion for you as we go ahead. So if I have to briefly put out, as to how this particular INI CET entrance was, as far as my subject radiology is concerned, I would say that it was both easy as well as hard. Why do I say so? I'll say so because I think it was easy, because if you've gone through the previous AIIMS papers, previous JIPMER papers, a lot of topics were repeatedly asked over the last exams as well as in this exam. So for example, there was a question on FAST and eFAST. I'm sure if you have seen the June AIIMS PG discussion, that we had, we are with you sessions that we had, right? There was a question on FAST in both JIPMER as well as AIIMS exams in the June session. There was again one in the INI CET as well. There were questions on, basic critical diagnosis like pneumothorax. Right, there is always, I have always said in AIIMS or in JIPMER, there is always questions either on intestinal obstruction. Last time in June there was a question on intestinal obstruction. This time there was a question on pneumoperitoneum. There were questions on barium spotters which are always asked. right? So there was again a question on achalasia cardia, the appearance with a clinical history which was given. So in this sense, I think the exam was easy because many questions as far as radiology is concerned were on basic important topics which were asked previously as well. It was also hard in a particular aspect, and that is that almost all questions, many questions were based upon the management. That is what they had asked. And in some questions it was totally bonkers, right? They had asked you about the chemotherapeutic agent that should be used to treat a particular tumor. I think expecting this from you at this level would be slightly difficult, I admit that, but that is how the exams are. All the questions are not actually meant for each one of you, right? And this was the type of exam which was there, right? Most questions were straightforward questions on basic topics. A few of them were slightly different. We are going to discuss not only the questions, not only the answers to them, we will also try and rule out various options, right? We will also look at the allied topics related to that particular question that could be asked potentially in the upcoming exams. More of this analysis as we go ahead in this particular discussion. So now one thing is for sure, remember, it is this integrated clinical approach is something which is a must whatever exam that you are preparing for now, right? Gone are the days when a one line or a one word answer questions were asked, right? Those days are gone. Now you have to prepare yourself, you have to brace yourself to face clinical questions which might be long questions, in which you must learn to quickly read the last line, first line and the options so as to get a gist as to what they are asking, exactly in that question. You are supposed to pick up the important clinical history pointers that the examiner is giving you. You have to make a habit to solve these types of questions. So integrated clinical approach is the only way to prepare now. Don't worry, we all are here to give you a lot of practice to help you prepare in this particular format in the countdown to the NEET PG exam. So are you all geared up? Let us start. Look at this first question. A post-cholecystectomy patient presents with collection in the Morrison's pouch or subhepatic space. A biliary leak is suspected. What will be the next best investigation? So a surgeon has operated a patient, lap cholecystectomy has been done, there is a collection, he is suspecting biliary leak. They are asking you what is to be done next. Now look at these particular investigations which were part of the answer, the options, and believe me, what would be the next best investigation? When I spoke to a lot of people, there appears to be a genuine controversy here. When I spoke to someone who was a nuclear medicine specialist, he told me that yes, HIDA could have a great use here. When I spoke to a lot of radiologists, they said that contrast enhanced CT scan, is of no great help here, right? But MRCP is a great modality which could help in the diagnosis. When I spoke to a lot of surgeons, almost all of them said that ERCP is a very good option to go ahead with. So what is to be done? Let us try to, identify this, or let us try to assess this in a very objective way. See, whose patient is this? It is the surgeon's patient, right? The surgeon is the primary person who is treating this. So what does the surgeon want to know? He wants to know whether there is a biliary leak. Yes or no? He wants a definitive answer. He wants to know what is the site of leak, whether it is a complete transection, what is the extent of injury as well, whether it is a complete transection or just a small nick on one side of the biliary duct, and what is the site, whether it is an aberrant duct which is injured, whether it is the common bile duct which is injured. He wants to know that. He can therefore then plan as to how it can be treated, right? He also wants to know how invasive the diagnostic technique is going to be. So based on all these points, now let us try to evaluate the modalities that we have. We have ruled out contrast enhanced CT scan because that offers no distinct advantage over the other modalities. Now tell me, can a HIDA scan tell you whether there is a leak, biliary leak or not? Yes, because this immunodiacetic acid compound, it is going to be secreted into the biliary tree. Once it comes into the biliary tree, if there is a leak, it is going to come into the peritoneal cavity. So HIDA scan will help you detect a leak. So will MRCP, so will ERCP, endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, right? Now MRCP, with its highly T2 weighted images, believe me, gives us a very, very beautiful visualization of almost the entire biliary tree. There is a recent advancement of MRCP, and that is to use a certain hepatocyte specific agents like mangafodipyr trisodium. So what is this mangafodipyr trisodium? Once you inject it, it goes into the liver parenchyma, it is secreted into the bile, so therefore you can actually see the contrast leaking out. That is a very distinct advantage of doing MRCP with a hepatocyte specific agent. Now can these modalities help you identify the site of leak? HIDA scan, unfortunately, with its very poor spatial resolution, will not help you identify the exact site of leak. It will not. Can MRCP help you identify the site of leak? We just discussed with mangafodipyr trisodium with hepatocyte specific contrast material. MRCP can help you detect the site of leak. So can ERCP definitively show you from where the contrast is leaking. It is like a live fluoroscopy cine loop that you will get when you do an ERCP. What about the treatment? Can HIDA scan help you in treatment at all? No. Other than just showing you this, other than just showing you whether there is a leak or not, it will not help you in treatment at all. MRCP will not help you in treatment directly, but it will show you the site of leak, isn't it? Based on that, you can plan treatment, but direct treatment is not possible. Tell me, can ERCP help you in treating the leak as well? Yes. One of the distinct advantages of ERCP is that you can do a sphincterotomy, you can put a stent across the common bile duct, and that is how it can help you, treat that particular case. That is a very important advantage. But now comes the very important question as to whether it is invasive, right? HIDA scan is non-invasive. MRCP invasive, right? But ERCP, yes, is definitely invasive. An endoscopy is going to be done, the cannula is going to be passed into the ampulla of Vater, and then contrast is going to be injected. So this, I think, is the biggest disadvantage of doing an ERCP. When I went through a lot of books, not just radiology standard reference texts, but also, I went through surgery books, I went through hepatobiliary surgery books, I came across a lots of, references. So now, friends, we come to the $1 million question, and that is, what is the final answer? I'm sure by now we are all able to rule out one particular option, and that is contrast enhanced CT, because this offers no distinct advantage. It is not going to identify the site of leak, right? It is not going to be the investigation to be done here. Now let us discuss each of these options one by one. We've already discussed the utility as far as the clinical applications as to what a surgeon wants. A HIDA scan, right, may theoretically identify the leak. There is an argument that theoretically this is the most sensitive investigation and therefore this should be the answer. But my point is that the examiner is not asking you a theoretical question here, is he? In fact, he is asking the exact opposite. He is asking you a clinical practice based question. And practically, you go to any hospital, you speak to any surgeon, you speak to any gastroenterologist, and he will tell you that HIDA scan is not done today. I rest my argument there, right? So therefore, today practically in our hospitals, a HIDA scan is not done in this particular situation. That cannot be the answer. We have two options remaining. One is MRCP, one is ERCP. As a radiologist, I have a natural bias towards choosing MRCP. Beautiful, wonderful modality MRI is, right? And MRI, will be able to beautifully identify the site of leak as well. It is a non-invasive investigation. And therefore, because it is a practice-based question, I again spoke to some gastroenterologists, spoke to surgeons, experienced surgeons. I spoke to, gastric hepatobiliary surgeons as well. And many of them, almost all of them said that what they would choose to do is ERCP. I'll give you a clinical example. Suppose that there is a patient who is admitted with myocardial infarction and you want to know whether there is a plaque which is causing stenosis of any of the coronary arteries. You have two options. You can do a CT coronary angiography or an angiography, invasive angiography, right, for this evaluation. Though CT pulmonary angiography is almost as accurate right, as doing a coronary angiography. Almost all cardiologists will prefer to do a direct, most definitive diagnostic technique, and that is a direct invasive coronary angiography. Even if a plaque is diagnosed on CT, coronary angiography, before treating it with angioplasty, a confirmatory invasive coronary angio is always done. If you apply the same logic here, like I told you at the very start of this discussion, whose patient is this? This is a patient of the surgeon who has operated it. If there is a biliary leak, there is a serious complication which can occur. Patient can go into peritonitis, sepsis, right? So we don't want that to happen. Doing an MRCP, getting its report, and then diagnosing a leak is going to, waste around 24 to 36 hours from diagnosis to the treatment. Doing an ERCP right away, right, is going to make a definitive diagnosis. There is a therapeutic option available as well. I specifically ask these practitioners, senior surgeons, hepatobiliary surgeons, as to whether ERCP is invasive. Is it indicated, or is it possible to do a second invasive diagnostic and therapeutic technique like ERCP in a patient who has already been operated? Well, they said ERCP is really not as invasive as doing a surgery. It is, after all, just an endoscopic procedure, and therefore there is no contraindication of doing ERCP in a post-laparoscopic cholecystectomy clinical setting. Rather, it is more preferable because it will not only give you a diagnosis but also give therapeutic options. And therefore, I am going to take this risk on my head. In spite of being a radiologist, I am going to go against what my bias is, against what my fraternity wants me to choose, and I am going to say that in this particular question, I am going to choose ERCP as the more preferable answer over MRCP. That is what I am going to do. If you go to books, you may find contradictory references. This is what is the opinion of consensus and logic that I explained to you, that I have come to. Let us look at an extra edge fact. In a suspected case of iatrogenic biliary duct injury during cholecystectomy, which of the following classification system is used? I'm sure traditionally in your books, all of you have read about this Bismuth classification. But what I found new when I was reading a lot of articles on this particular topic is that Bismuth classification is an older classification system which usually deals with, biliary duct injuries in open surgery or open cholecystectomy. Nowadays, most cholecystectomies are not done in an open manner. They are lap cholecystectomies, right? And in lap cholecystectomy, the injury pattern to the biliary ducts may be slightly different. There could be aberrant ducts, right and left, hepatic ducts which may be damaged rather than the common bile duct, and therefore a newer classification system has been devised. What is that? It is called as Strasberg. Rather, Strasberg classification system is more comprehensive because it includes the categories in Bismuth classification also. In addition to that, injuries to the right hepatic duct or aberrant right hepatic duct, just a small nick to the duct rather than a complete transection are also included. And therefore, what classification systems are used? It is both Bismuth and Strasberg. I hope you got the difference between them. Strasberg is more new. It includes laparoscopic injury patterns. It also includes the categories of Bismuth classification, and therefore remember, in this particular answer, what I am going to choose in this particular question as the answer is ERCP over MRCP. My answer here is ERCP. Yes. A patient presents with bluish discoloration of toe, intermittent claudication. Which of the following will be the next appropriate investigation in this particular patient? So what are we looking at, right? The features that you see here point towards ischemia of the distal part of the foot, and therefore what we are probably looking at in this particular case is peripheral vascular disease. Before we go to the various options, let us discuss a concept, let us discuss a rule as to whenever they ask you how to image a case of vascular abnormalities, is there a rule that we can follow? Is there a concept sequence which can follow? Yes, we can. And what is that? The initial investigation usually for all vascular abnormalities is a duplex study. Remember, duplex means what? Two things. One is a B mode ultrasound, and two, it is going to be a color Doppler. So that is what is called as a duplex study. This is usually the first step or initial investigation. If they ask you what is investigation of choice, then the investigation of choice almost always is going to be CT angiography, which is more commonly done in routine practice than a MR angiography. But if they ask you what is gold standard, then gold standard is a technique which is most definitive, but it is invasive. So what is that? That is going to be catheter angiography. That is going to be catheter angiography, right? So this is the sequence to be followed. Let us apply this now. So for peripheral vascular disease also, again the first or initial investigation is going to be a duplex scan. Investigation of choice is going to be a CT angio. Gold standard is going to be a catheter angio. Right now, let us apply it to few more conditions. Does it apply almost everywhere? In renal artery stenosis, which is a vascular abnormality, isn't it? The first investigation is usually a renal Doppler. Investigation of choice is again CT angio more than MR angio. If there is renal impairment, contrast cannot be injected, then you can inject, then you can do an MR angio without injection of contrast, that is time of flight, right? Gold standard is of course going to be invasive catheter angios. Yes, so for most of the vascular abnormalities, this sequence is going to hold. Are there exceptions? Yes, venous abnormalities can be exceptions, especially venous abnormalities involving the extremities, like varicose veins, deep venous thrombosis. And this was a question which was asked in one of the recent FMG exams, right? What is the investigation of choice for peripheral extremity venous abnormalities like varicosities or deep venous thrombosis? It is in fact a duplex study, which is not the first one now. It is rather the investigation of choice duplex study, that is a combination of ultrasound plus color Doppler. So that is the investigation of choice. Now a question was asked in one of the FMG exams, the gold standard investigation for deep venous thrombosis. Remember, the most definitive gold standard for any vascular abnormality is always going to be invasive catheter, but here because we are evaluating veins, it is called invasive catheter venography. Right, this is going to be for venous abnormalities. So for pulmonary thromboembolism, which is also a vascular abnormality, isn't it? Right, the initial investigation is usually, this is a different, this is D-dimer, which has a very high negative predictive value. The investigation of choice, again it holds, it is CT pulmonary angiography. Gold standard also holds what we have studied till now, and that is gold standard is a invasive catheter angiography. Right, so this is a rule, this is a sequence you might follow for most of the vascular abnormalities. In some cases, as in venous abnormalities, it has changed. As in pulmonary thromboembolism, the first or screening test is usually a blood test, that is D-dimer. Right, so in this patient who has peripheral vascular disease, the next appropriate investigation is definitely going to be duplex scan. Now let us look at this particular question. In EFAST, which of the following is included apart from the abdomen? Now before we go into the options, let us quickly look at what FAST is, how to manage a patient. It is one of the first steps which is employed whenever you get an abdomen trauma patient. So how to manage an abdominal trauma patient? There are a few articles who say that irrespective of whether the patient is hemodynamically unstable or hemodynamically stable, right, the first step which is usually done in evaluation of an abdominal trauma patient is FAST. So what is FAST? It is usually the first step in evaluation of the patient. Then depending upon whether it is FAST positive or FAST negative, various strategies can be used. We are going to discuss this as we go ahead. The main purpose of putting out this particular protocol is to make you realize that FAST is the first step for evaluation. Let us start. So why is ultrasound used? What is FAST? FAST stands for Focused Assessment with Sonography in Trauma. But why is FAST used? Remember, there is a concept which is involved. And what is that concept? That concept says that, remember, fluid is the friend of ultrasound, air is the enemy of ultrasound. So the purpose of using FAST or ultrasound in abdomen trauma is to detect intraperitoneal free fluid. Remember, fluid is friend of ultrasound means what? Wherever in the body you want to detect minimal quantities of fluid, right? What is the investigation you should do? The investigation that you should do is always ultrasound. So where you want to detect minimal quantities of fluid in the pericardial, cavity, you should do ultrasound. That is echocardiography. That is the best investigation. Minimal quantities of fluid in the pleural cavity, pleural effusion, best is what, right? Most sensitive is what? Ultrasound. USG thorax. Similarly, if you want to detect minimal free fluid within the peritoneal cavity, it is ultrasound and application of ultrasound which is used here is fast. So what does it mean when you detect intraperitoneal free fluid in an abdomen trauma patient? It means that you're not looking at clear fluid, but rather you're looking at hemoperitoneum, probably secondary to solid organ injury. That is what it means. So fast, remember, is actually a part of a protocol or a technique which is called as POCUS. What is POCUS? You must have heard of, on Twitter, you must have come across POTUS, President of the United States. So what is this POCUS? POCUS is nothing but point of care ultrasound. Point of care ultrasound. Point of care ultrasound, as the name suggests, ultrasound technique which is employed at the point of care, that is where the patient is. So it is done either in the ICU, or it is done in the operation theater, or it is done in the emergency room where the patient is at the bedside. There you provide ultrasound services. That is what is called as point of care ultrasound. And because it is being done at different places, not necessarily in the radiology department, it is quite obvious to state that it is not always done by radiologists. So it is going to be done by a surgeon, an anesthetist, an intensivist. Whoever is there, whoever has the necessary training, is going to provide this point of care ultrasound services to the patient. Fast, because of the emergency setting in which it is done, is also a part of point of care ultrasound. So what is the fast protocol? It has to be done literally very fast. Right? 4 sites are assessed in the abdomen: right upper quadrant, subxiphoid, left upper quadrant, and suprapubic. When we assess right upper quadrant and left upper quadrant, we quickly look at the solid organs there, that is the liver and the right kidney, spleen and the left kidney, the dependent space between them, that is the Morrison's pouch on the right, hepatorenal pouch, splenorenal pouch on the left. When we look at subxiphoid area, we look at the left lobe of liver, pericardial cavity for pericardial effusions. Similarly, when we look at suprapubic regions, we look at pelvic organs, urinary bladder, cul-de-sac, whether there is any free fluid within them. Now, given that there were 2 questions rather, on fast itself in the June session exams which were conducted. Again, in this INICET, there was a question on fast. Let us explore fast a little bit more deeper. Let us try to, look at certain topics in fast which are relatively new, which could be asked as potential MCQs. One such, thing that I found was that there was a question which was asked, and that is which quadrant has the maximum sensitivity for detection of hemoperitoneum. Out of these 4 quadrants, which is that quadrant which has the maximum sensitivity for detection of hemoperitoneum? That particular quadrant is the right upper quadrant. So that is the right upper quadrant, and therefore if you see the numbers that I've put out, what is the first quadrant you should evaluate when doing a fast? This could be another question, and that first quadrant is also going to be the right upper quadrant. Why? Because it is in this area that we are able to evaluate the Morrison's pouch. What is the Morrison's pouch? It is the hepatorenal pouch. This is one of the most dependent parts of the peritoneal cavity in the supine position, and this is where blood or fluid is going to accumulate first when the patient is in supine position. And therefore, remember, the right upper quadrant or the Morrison's pouch region is the first view to be obtained, and because it is the most sensitive one to detect minimal hemoperitoneum. So this is what I found which was new. Few more things we are going to discuss. Now, when we're doing fast, they try to extend the fast protocol, and this extended fast is what is called as E-fast. E stands for what? E stands for extended. And how did they extend it? What extra did they involve? They involved the thoracic region. Now, in the thoracic region, specific assessment is basically done at 2 sites, right? One, it is done at the anterosuperior hemithoraxis or anterosuperior thorax. And why is it done here? These 2 areas that you see here, this one and this one. And why is it done here? Anterosuperior thorax evaluation is done to pick up pneumothorax, right? Air within the pleural cavity, which could also be a result of chest trauma, right? And another area which is evaluated is the hypochondriac regions, overlying the lower ribs, and in hypochondriac regions we want to specifically look for pleural fluid collections, right, or hemothorax, traumatic hemothorax, which could be there. So this is what is extended fast. I hope you've got the answer to the question there. So in extended fast protocol, what is evaluated in addition to abdomen is what? It is the thoracic regions. So how do you interpret fast now, right? So if there's a history of abdominal trauma, you do fast, and on fast you see free fluid is positive, then it is called as fast positive or positive fast evaluation. So when fast is positive, what does it mean? Conceptually, it means there is fluid within the peritoneal cavity. This fluid is nothing but blood, very likely to be hemoperitoneum due to solid organ injury. Then what to do next? That depends upon the patient's hemodynamic status. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, you can do the investigation of choice for solid organ injury, that is contrast enhanced CT scan. One important pointer, friends, in abdomen trauma, whenever you do a CT, that is investigation of choice for solid organ injury, it always has to be a contrast enhanced CT for abdominal trauma evaluation. Whereas if you look at head trauma, it is always non-contrast CT. No rule of contrast in head trauma evaluation, that is always a non-contrast CT. But for abdomen trauma, it has to be a contrast enhanced CT in order to visualize the contusions and lacerations better in the abdominal organs, solid organs. But if there is fast is positive and patient is hypotensive, patient is hemodynamically unstable, do you have time to do CT scan? No, because the patient is rapidly deteriorating. The patient may collapse any moment, and therefore you don't have time to do CT. You presume that there is a solid organ injury or contusion. You wheel in the patient into the operation theater. There has to be an emergency laparotomy that is needed to be done. So this is how the fast interpretation and rather management protocol that we have discussed here. So let us look at some specifics now. What is the most commonly used USG probe for fast? These are all extra edge techniques, that extra edge facts that we are discussing. The most commonly used probe for doing fast is a convex or sector probe. Convex or sector probe, which has a frequency of around say 2 to 5 megahertz. So it has a frequency of around 2 to 5 megahertz. What is the first quadrant which is scanned? That is also the quadrant which is most sensitive for detection of minimal hemoperitoneum. We have discussed this, isn't it? And this quadrant is nothing but the right upper quadrant, which is scanned as the first quadrant when we start. That is most sensitive. Yes. So look at this question now. In eFast, which of the following is included apart from the abdomen? We have just discussed it is the thoracic cavity. That too we have discussed. It is evaluated at two parts. One is the anterosuperior thoracis, that is to look for pneumothorax, and second is the hypochondriac regions, right in the lower part overlying the lower ribs, right where the ribs overlie, and this is to look for fluid within the pleural cavity, that is hemothorax. Yes. See, the previous AIIMS exam, there was a question which was asked. FAST stands for, it stands for focused assessment with sonography in trauma. Yes. So look at this image. This was a question which was asked previously. In this fast image in a trauma patient denotes what? So look at this ultrasound image here. There are some labels which have been placed here, right? This is the liver, this is the kidney, this is the cortex, the outer cortex, this is the inner medulla. Look at the area in between the liver and the kidney. Can you see here in this particular area, right? You can see a black appearance there. What is that? That is nothing but fluid. In the USG interpretation protocol, we have discussed fluid or water appears hypoechoic or black on ultrasound, and that is how the fluid is appearing there. If you see fluid in the hepatorenal pouch or Morrison's pouch, we know there is, this fluid is nothing but blood or hemoperitoneum, right? And this suggests that it is going to be positive fast. We also discussed in the interpretation protocol, the next step in the management is going to depend upon the patient's hemodynamic status. If the patient is stable, you can do a contrast enhanced CT, that is investigation of choice for solid organ injury. If the patient is hemodynamically unstable, right, then you have to wheel in the patient in the OT and do an exploratory emergency laparotomy. Yes. So USG or FAST is least useful in, can you just see the sheer number of questions that have been asked? on this particular topic. And now do you agree when I say that this AIIMS or this INI CET was also relatively easy, because there were many questions which were asked on repeated topics, similar topics which were also there last time. The same topic questions were asked this time as well. So this INI CET discussion that all the Marrow faculty members are going to come together and take for you is going to be a very high yield kind of a discussion, you know, as you're preparing for the upcoming exams. So USG or FAST is least useful in what? Tell me, can FAST be used to detect pneumothorax? Yes. Extended FAST protocol is used to assess the thoracic cavity. Yes. Can it be used to detect pericardial effusion? Yes, of course. When you keep the probe in the subxiphoid area, you look for pericardial effusion specifically. Now, renal injury, kidneys are retroperitoneal structures and retroperitoneal hematomas. If I take you back to the previous slide and show you the image, look at this image. On this image, tell me, can you see the right kidney on this particular image? Yes, you can actually see the right kidney here, isn't it? So can you see, if you're able to visualize the kidney, will you be able to pick up a large renal laceration or a contusion which is there? Yes, but remember, it is proven through multiple studies that the sensitivity of ultrasound for detection of retroperitoneal collections, especially retroperitoneal hematomas, is extremely poor. Though kidneys are also retroperitoneal, being a prominent solid organ, we are able to see them well on ultrasound, but small retroperitoneal hematomas may very easily be missed. And therefore, if I have to choose between renal injury and retroperitoneal hematoma, USG or FAST is least useful, least sensitive in detection of retroperitoneal hematomas. Yes. So look at this particular question now. Again, an example as to why this exam could be stated as easy, because pneumothorax, there was a question in the previous exam as well, right? Again, in this exam, there was a question. There is a reason, you know, why the examiner is, you know, emphasizing on all these topics. And that is because all these conditions are critical, life-threatening conditions, the diagnosis of which is relatively easy, right? But making the diagnosis is important, because if you miss this diagnosis, it is going to be life-threatening. The patient might even die. And therefore, as a, you know, tool to assess your competence or your preparation at this stage, the examiner expects that all of you must be able to answer questions based on these very, very critical conditions, like hemoperitoneum, solid organ injury, pneumothorax, intestinal obstruction, perforation, head injuries, EDH, SDH. So these are topics which have been repeatedly emphasized. That is the reason behind it. So look at this question. A 25-year-old male patient was brought to the ER after road traffic accident. He is having tachycardia. He is hypotensive. On examination, hyperresonance is heard over the right side of chest. Look at the radiograph. In this particular radiograph, I want you to look at the right hemithorax and the left hemithorax. Can you see a difference between them? Yes, there is a very important difference. And before we go to the management, let us look at this radiograph. A similar radiograph to this was given in your exam. Now I want you to compare again the appearance of the right hemithorax versus the left hemithorax. Now if you see here, the right hemithorax here is appearing excessively black. Black means lucent. Excessively black is termed as hyperlucent in radiological terms. So it is appearing hyperlucent. Look at these red arrows. They are pointing towards a sharp line, right, which is nothing but the surface of the lung which is collapsed. This lung surface is now being lined by air, and therefore it is seen as a sharp line. Differential radiographic density theory. Now if you look, right, there is some mediastinal shift because the mediastinum has been shifted towards the opposite side. The diaphragm has also been shifted down. Look at this costophrenic angle sulcus. It has become extremely deep there, right? I want you to compare the space between the ribs, two adjacent ribs on the left side, see, and just look at the space between two adjacent ribs on the right side. The ribs appear widely separated because there is a hyper expansion of the rib cage. All these findings suggest a diagnosis of pneumothorax. Let us look at them one by one. We already saw that there is hyperlucency. There is hyperlucency with absent vascular markings which is there. This sharp line which we could see here is nothing but the visceral pleural line which is there. There is mediastinal shift towards the opposite side. Yes, there is deep sulcus sign. This costophrenic angle sulcus being pushed down because of the excessive air. Mass effect on the dome of diaphragm is called deep sulcus sign. Mass effect on the mediastinum, pushing the mediastinum to the opposite side side, and we also saw that there is a hyper expansion of the rib cage which is also there if you look at the distance between the two adjacent ribs. Remember, when you see these findings, this is what is suggestive of pneumothorax. Really? Is it the complete diagnosis? The answer is no. That is because whenever you are evaluating a case of pneumothorax, you must always make it a habit and try and search for all these 5 findings, especially the last 3 ones, which are findings related to mass effect. What is mass effect? Mass effect of the air pushing the mediastinum to the opposite side. Mass effect pushing the dome of diaphragm downwards. Mass effect causing hyper expansion of the rib cage. If you see prominent mass effect as a result of pneumothorax, then your diagnosis changes from routine pneumothorax to tension pneumothorax. So then it becomes tension pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax is a potentially life-threatening condition in which there is a one-way valve mechanism that exists in between the lung and the pleural cavity. Air can enter into the pleura, but it cannot come out, right? And therefore it is trapped in the pleura. With each and every breath, more and more air is going to enter into the pleural cavity. So what will happen? Eventually the intrapleural pressure becomes extremely high, much greater than the atmospheric pressure. It compresses the veins. So what will happen? Venous return is blocked. So cardiac output falls. Patient deteriorates, patient collapses, may die within a few minutes. The primary cause of death in a case of tension pneumothorax is usually cardiovascular collapse rather than respiratory collapse. Of course, there's going to be respiratory compromise, but the acute event is usually a cardiovascular collapse. Therefore, what the examiner has been repeatedly asking you over the past few years, multiple times in your exams, is what is the management? So how do you treat tension pneumothorax? Remember, when you treat tension pneumothorax, the first step in treatment is usually needle thoracotomy. Put a needle in the thorax. So what will happen? You are creating a communication between the pleura and the atmosphere. Because of the high pressure gradient, air is going to come out. Where to put this is also important. In adults, the needle is usually put in the 5th intercostal space, usually around very close anterior to the mid-axillary line, just anterior to it. In children, it is usually put in the 2nd intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. This is also important. You need to remember this. So when you put a needle, most of the air will come out. But the point when there is an equalization of pressure between the pleural cavity and the atmosphere, the air will stop coming out. Some amount of residual air will remain. What to do for it now? It is plain pneumothorax. How to treat plain pneumothorax? You treat it with ICD insertion. This is the second step. The ICD is inserted in the triangle of safety, the base of which is formed by the 5th intercostal space. So the complete treatment of pneumothorax, tension pneumothorax rather, first step is needle thoracotomy to relieve the tension component. Next, put an intercostal drain. Gradually over the next few days or weeks, the air will be resorbed and the pneumothorax will completely disappear. So in this case, you can see that there is hyperlucency with absent vascular markings, there is mediastinal shift, there is deep sulcus sign, hyperexpanded ribcage. This is tension pneumothorax. So the best way to treat it is option number 2, wide bore needle insertion in the 5th intercostal space to relieve the tension component, followed by an intercostal drain to treat the remaining pneumothorax. So see, previous AIIMS exam, there was a similar question. Patient was being mechanically ventilated in the ICU, showed worsening respiratory status. Again, we can see that there is hyperlucency with absent vascular markings. Mass effect is there. So again, in this case, diagnosis was pneumothorax, right? So this appearance is what? Now if we compare the appearance on M mode ultrasound, remember all these appearances have been described on what? On M mode USG. We see an appearance which is called seashore sign. That is, the chest wall forms the waves and the lung forms the sand. Right, so chest wall and waves, this is a seashore sign which is seen in normal patients, but in pneumothorax there is a stratosphere or a barcode sign, as you can see there. So a question was asked, a patient of road traffic accident, presence over chest and limbs injury, presence with low oxygen saturation, M mode ultrasound shows, and this was the clincher in this particular case, right? The answer was, if you see stratosphere sign or barcode sign is seen in pneumothorax. Seashore sign is seen in normal patients. Now look at this particular question. A boy presents with pallor and lymphadenopathy. His skull X-ray is given below. Which of the following drug is most appropriate for the suspected diagnosis? Now the examiner is giving you some clues in this particular question. Firstly, he tells you that it is a pediatric age group, so it is a boy. Presence with complaints, so he has given you a clinical history. The clinical history is non-specific, pallor and lymphadenopathy. And on the image, he has shown you a skull radiograph on which there are multiple well-defined or few, well-defined lytic lesions which are there. Now, before I go into the options and discuss them, I'm going to try and employ a smart work strategy here. Right, and let us try and get into the examiner's head. How are we going to do that? Let me give you an example. Now suppose, one way of studying or preparing for your exams is, to go through each and every topic in depth, remember all the clinical features, imaging findings, management related or investigation related protocols, management protocols for each condition one by one. But rather, there could be another way of preparing topics, and that is a smarter way, and that is what I'm going to come to at this particular point. Now, for example, let me give you an example of this particular strategy. In your exam, you see a wrist radiograph. Now, can you believe it that on a wrist radiograph, if you ever see one in your exam, believe me, other than trauma, that is fractures, there are hardly 3 to 4 important diagnoses that can be made on a wrist radiograph. That is all that you expect to see. So on a wrist radiograph, the moment you see a wrist radiograph in your exam, apart from trauma, what is the diagnosis that the examiner can show you? Most commonly, he is trying to show you probably a case of rheumatoid arthritis, right? Or it could be, say, for example, Kienbock's disease, like that is the osteochondritis involving the lunate, right? Or sometimes occasionally, in this particular area, he may show you scapholunate dislocation or dissociation, right? So remember, at a wrist radiograph, if it is a pediatric age group, your examiner is probably trying to show you rickets, widening, cupping, fraying of the metaphyseal region, right? Widening of the physeal plate of cartilage, right? So that is what the examiner is trying to show you. So hardly 3 to 4 diagnoses at the wrist. Suppose your examiner shows you a knee radiograph in your exam, right? What is he trying to show you? Probably he is trying to show you the commonest finding at the knee joint, and that is degenerative osteoarthritis. He may be trying to show you, say, apart from trauma, right? He may try and show you certain conditions like hemophilia in which the intercondylar notch becomes prominent. So again, very few findings that could be seen at the knee joint as well. Similarly, now let us consider a differential diagnosis as to when you see a lytic lesion in the skull vault, what are all the possible diagnoses that the examiner is trying to show you? Let us consider them together. So this is what I'm going to use here. This is what I call is the pattern based approach towards skull lytic lesions. So whenever in the exam you see a skull radiograph with a lytic lesion, remember there are only a few handful of conditions that you should immediately think of. Even before you jump to the image, believe it or not, even if you just look at the history of the patient and the age of the patient, that itself is going to give you a diagnosis within a few seconds. This is how this strategy is going to work out. Let us see whether we can actually make it happen. So the first things you should think of when you see a lytic lesion in the skull is either an eosinophilic granuloma or a Langerhans histiocytosis. It could be neuroblastoma metastasis. It could be Paget's disease, which can give rise to focal geographic lytic lesions, which are called as osteoporosis circumscripta, right? It could be hyperparathyroidism, which will not give rise to focal lesions, but rather a diffuse, dirty appearance of the skull vault. It could be your examiner's favorite, and that is multiple myeloma. Right, it could be skull vault metastasis as well. Now, this is the short list of few important conditions you should consider whenever you look at skull lytic lesions. Believe it or not, as I told you at the start of this discussion, if you just look at the age of the patient, you'll be able to clinch the diagnosis. Because of these 6 conditions, 2 conditions are seen exclusively in the pediatric age group, and that is eosinophilic granuloma and Langerhans histiocytosis and neuroblastoma metastasis. These are seen exclusively in the pediatric age group, whereas 2 conditions among these are seen predominantly only in the elderly age group, more than 60 years, right? Mainly. So what are those two conditions? It is multiple myeloma and metastasis. These are predominantly seen in the elderly age group. Now the remaining two, Paget's and hyperparathyroidism, do not have a fixed age range, but they are very commonly seen in the middle-aged adults or the elderly patients. Now let us consider them one by one, and in doing so we are going to 1. Look at the image, 2. Look at the clinical features, and 3. Look at the classical imaging findings. I'm sure by the end of this particular short discussion you will be able to clinch the diagnosis whenever you come across any skull lytic lesion. Let us make it happen now. Let us start with Langerhans cell histiocytosis or eosinophilic granuloma, right? A pediatric age group, so a child presents with non-specific clinical features like pain, anorexia, weight loss, lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly, right? Along with this, sometimes occasionally there could be localized pain and swelling. You look at a skull wall, and in the radiograph what you see here basically is a well-defined lytic lesion which is there. How has it been described? So it has been described as round to oval geographic lytic lesions in the skull vault of a child. This is the clincher of eosinophilic granuloma. Because there is a bevelling of the edges, this is also given a name, right? Radiologically it has been named as a hole within a hole appearance. Sometimes within this lytic lesion you can see a dense bone. So this island of bone within a lytic lesion is what is called as button sequestrum. In the vertebral column it gives rise to a flattened vertebra, a complete collapse of the vertebral body. So this is what is called as a vertebra plana. Remember, whenever you look at vertebra plana in the pediatric age group, the commonest underlying cause is going to be eosinophilic granuloma, right? So will you be able to identify it? Geographic well-defined lytic lesion in the skull vault in a child is what? Unless proven otherwise, it is always going to be, remember, eosinophilic granuloma. Yes. Now a child presents with abdominal distension, a large abdominal mass, and a soft tissue, a bulge which is felt on the skull vault. The mother, feels this particular bulge, and the child is brought for examination. You see that the abdomen is huge, bulging. There is a large intra-abdominal mass. So a child with a large abdominal mass and focal swelling with or without pain on that particular part on the head, right? You look at a radiograph, or in this case a CT reconstructed image or a scanogram, you see that there is a destructive or a lytic lesion which is there in the skull vault along with a soft tissue component, because this is a neoplastic metastatic deposit arising from the neuroblastoma in the abdomen. A very peculiar feature, as you can see in this particular image, there is these sun ray or sunburst appearance or spiculated lesion, which is a very peculiar feature of neuroblastoma metastasis. So the combination in a child of an intra-abdominal large mass which frequently crosses the midline, encases the abdominal aorta and the important visceral blood vessel branches, along with lytic lesions in the skull vault with a sunburst or a spiculated appearance, suggests a diagnosis of neuroblastoma with metastasis. Now in an adult, right, or in a child without an intra-abdominal mass, you see a skull lytic lesion with such sunburst or spiculated appearance. It could also be an incidentally detected hemangioma. This will almost never be associated with an intra-abdominal mass. The combination of intra-abdominal mass and such lesions suggests neuroblastoma with METs. Yes. Now we come to Paget's disease. When you study the pathophysiology of Paget's disease, you would realize it is usually seen in the middle age or in the elderly age group. It presents with non-specific clinical features, so localized pain, increased temperature due to hyperemia at the site of the bone lesions. Bone expansion, remember, is a classic peculiarity of Paget's disease. So bone expansion is a very, very important finding. If you just focus on this finding, remember, you will be able to diagnose Paget's disease very, very well. Just look at this skull radiograph. In this skull radiograph, can you see how significant the bone expansion or diploic widening is seen here, right? This finding of bone expansion or diploic widening is almost never seen in any other conditions that we are discussing here as a differential diagnosis. So this is more or less clinch the diagnosis for you. diploic widening or bone expansion is the most important diagnostic feature of Paget's disease. Like I told you, in neuroblastoma metastasis, the sunburst appearance is the clincher. In Paget's disease, this is the bone expansion which is going to be the clincher. If there is a focal lytic lesion, it has been called as osteoporosis circumscripta, right? More common, however, is a diffuse involvement of the skull wall. If you remember, in Paget's disease, there is a lytic phase, there is a blastic phase, right? There is a hyperemic phase, right? So because of this diffuse generalized involvement, the overall skull appearance becomes a very dirty appearance of the skull vault, and this is what is called as the cotton wool skull. So this is what is called as the cotton wool skull. Now remember, what happens in Paget's disease is that, because of this diploic space widening, right, the overall thickness of the skull vault has increased, but at the level of the craniovertebral junction, and the cervical spine is pushing into the skull base because of bone softening, there is basilar invagination. So just imagine, at the skull base, the spine, cervical spine is pushing into the skull base, there is basilar invagination, but on the top, right, the cranium is going to expand. So this cranium more or less, spills over or hangs over the skull base and takes the shape of a peculiar hat like this, right? Can you see this hat? What is the shape? The more or less the contour of the hat is hanging over and above the base of the hat. So this is what is given a name. This is what is called as the Tam O'Shanter sign. Once you see this particular appearance and look at the radiograph, because of the bone expansion, it is hanging over. This is called as the Tam O'Shanter sign. In the vertebral column, this is going to give rise to picture frame vertebra, a sclerotic margin all around the vertebral body, ivory vertebra, a vertebra which is densely white. All these are features of Paget's disease, but as I told you, the most clincher here is bone expansion or diploic widening. Now another condition can give rise to a diffusely dirty appearing skull, and that is hyperparathyroidism. If you look at this particular skull vault here, in this particular case, you will see that the skull vault is diffusely affected. In most of the cases of hyperparathyroidism, you do not see a focal lytic lesion, but a diffuse involvement of the skull vault. Again, middle-aged, patients, non-specific complaints like vague pain, clavicular fractures, or say occasionally lytic lesions, or resorption of the lateral ends of clavicles is seen. Radiologically, very peculiar features. Diffuse skull involvement gives rise to a dirty appearance. This has been called as the salt and pepper, that is interspersed white and black appearance, or pepper pot skull. This diffuse involvement of the skull can be distinguished from that in Paget's by noting that in hyperparathyroidism there is no skull vault expansion or bone expansion, which is seen in Paget's. Here it is not seen, right? So no expansion or diploic widening. In the spine, hyperparathyroidism gives rise to typical alternate light and dark bands or white and black bands. This resembles a football jersey, so it is called as a rugger jersey spine. Another peculiar feature, and this has been asked as a part of an AIIMS question before, is the subperiosteal resorption along the radial aspect. Towards the thumb means the radius, towards the radius. So subperiosteal resorption along the metacarpals and phalanges on the radial aspect is another peculiar clincher of hyperparathyroidism. Excessive resorption may give rise to acrosteolysis, brown tumors which are focal excessive osteoclastic areas. Floating teeth occur when there is a resorption of the lamina dura. Why? Because excess of parathormone is going to give rise to excess bone resorption, and that is the reason why we see this subperiosteal resorption, brown tumors, acrosteolysis, or floating teeth, that is resorption of lamina dura. So again, a diffuse involvement. So out of these 6 conditions, 2 conditions are going to give rise to a diffuse involvement. They are Paget's and hyperparathyroidism. In Paget's, there will be bone expansion. In hyperparathyroidism, there will not be any bone expansion. Again, in an elderly age group, remember, you see multiple round to oval punched out lytic lesions, suggests multiple myeloma. So typically seen in more than 60 years of age. with bone pain, anemia, hypercalcemia, proteinuria, renal failure. These are peculiar features. You see multiple round to oval punched out lesions. It is given a name. What is it called as? This is what is called as the raindrop skull. This was also a recent NEET pattern question which was asked. Again, vertebra plana, that is a flattened vertebral body. Remember we discussed this. We are going to revise it again. Vertebra plana in a child is caused most commonly by, yes, eosinophilic granuloma. Vertebra plana in an adult or elderly age group, one of the commonest causes is multiple myeloma, right? There is again no bone expansion, no diploic widening. You can see the image there, multiple round to oval lytic lesions which are seen. Skull metastasis, again seen in the elderly age group. There could be a known primary, malignancy. Most common cause of skull metastasis, most common primary in cases of skull metastasis in females is usually CA breast. In males it is usually CA prostate. Lung cancer, colon cancer can also give rise. They do not have a specific imaging appearance. There are multiple lesions, but they are of variable sizes. In multiple myeloma, these lesions are more or less of similar sizes, giving rise to a raindrop skull appearance. In skull metastasis, these lesions are variable sizes. Again, vertebra plana may be seen. Now see, whenever you look at a radiograph, vertebral radiograph AP view, you can always see two pedicles like this. Now, one of the commonest site of vertebral involvement with metastasis is the pedicle. So if one pedicle is involved, that pedicle gets destroyed. So at a particular level, you see only one pedicle. This is what is called as the winking owl sign. So this is called as winking owl sign. This was a recent JIPMER question. If both the pedicles are lost, right, then it is what is called as a blind vertebra. So if one pedicle is destroyed, it is called winking owl. Both pedicles are destroyed, it is what is called as the blind vertebra sign. So again, whenever in your exam you see a skull lytic lesion, what you should think of? You should think of a handful of conditions, rather 6 conditions we discussed: eosinophilic granuloma, Langerhans cell histiocytosis or neuroblastoma mets, Paget's or hyperparathyroidism, multiple myeloma or metastasis. Remember, out of these 2 conditions, eosinophilic granuloma and neuroblastoma mets are seen exclusively in the pediatric age group. Multiple myeloma, metastasis exclusively, almost exclusively in the elderly age group. Paget's and hyperparathyroidism, middle age, diffuse involvement. There is bone expansion in Paget's, no bone expansion in hyperparathyroidism. So let us come back to this question. Therefore, in this particular question, when you see a history of a pediatric age group boy presenting with pallor, lymphadenopathy and lytic lesion in the skull vault, your diagnosis is what? Your diagnosis is eosinophilic granuloma or Langerhans cell histiocytosis. What is the treatment of this condition? This is a question which is actually a bonkers kind of a question. This is a bouncer at your level. So what to do? Even I was not aware of this particular, the answer to this question, honestly. And therefore I spoke to a lot of my colleagues. I spoke to a few surgeons. I spoke to, oncosurgeons. I spoke to oncologists. And then I asked them for a reference. They gave me a reference. So don't consider this answer because Dr. Mack is telling you that this is the answer. Dr. Mack has referred to one of the standard texts of oncology, pediatric hematology and oncology by, Lanskowski. And this book states that for the treatment of Langerhans cell histiocytosis and eosinophilic granuloma, a combination of vinblastine and prednisone is very commonly used. They classify patients into different groups, and again you see, look at the drugs which are used: prednisone, vinblastine, methotrexate. Almost for all groups, in different initial treatment as well as continuation, they use prednisone, vinblastine, methotrexate is also used. And therefore you look at the option, vinblastine and methotrexate are both used, but vinblastine is the first line treatment, and therefore in eosinophilic granuloma the answer to choose here in this particular question is vinblastine. So that is going to be the answer over here. Now look at this particular question. A 22-year-old male with road traffic accident was brought to the emergency room. On examination, his GCS was E2M2 V3, so he is having altered sensorium. He had no fractures, no hydrocephalus with raised intracranial tension. A non-contrast CT was performed as was found to be normal. What is the most likely diagnosis? Believe it or not, such a long question with a lot of history. This is in fact a history clincher. What is a history clincher? A history clincher is a condition in which the examiner gives you a history, and that history is so specific that it could just lead to one possible diagnosis. Throughout your different subjects, especially in your subjects like medicine, in your subjects like surgery, right, in your subjects like when you're studying radiology, these entities you study, even in microbiology, remember, there are a lot of history clinchers. Every microbe is known to cause a disease with a particular history, with a particular clinical presentation. It is a very prudent idea, a smart work strategy rather, to identify these history clinchers. You look at this history, it is going to clinch the diagnosis for you. So what is the history clincher here? A case of non-improving altered sensorium. Patient is, say, drowsy, patient has an altered sensorium which does not improve over time, with a history of head injury and with a normal early CT scan brain. So remember, non-improved altered sensorium in a head injury patient with normal early CT brain. This is a history clincher. This is going to give you a diagnosis. And what is that diagnosis? That diagnosis is diffuse axonal injury. Now, this topic of diffuse axonal injury has actually been unnecessarily complicated, in your various texts. It is actually a very, very simple topic. In fact, what this actually represents is given in its name itself. So what is this? This is nothing but an axonal level injury, but in a diffuse manner within the brain parenchyma. Let me give you an example. See, suppose that a man is walking on a road and he is hit by a car. So what is going to happen? He is going to be thrown off. Suppose two cars are traveling at a very high speed and they have a head-on collision on the highway. So what is going to happen? They are going to suddenly stop. So there is sudden deceleration. When a man is thrown off, when he is hit by a car, there is sudden acceleration. So remember, whenever there is sudden acceleration or sudden deceleration, there are shearing forces or distracting forces which are exerted onto the brain parenchyma. If you consider the neuronal structure, right, the neuron consists of a cell body and a neurofilament. Now, whenever a neuron is exerted to, such shearing forces or distracting forces are exerted onto a neuron, the neuronal structure simply breaks. Where does it break? It breaks at its weakest point. And what is the weakest point? The point where it breaks is this junction of the cell body and the neurofilament. So it exactly what happens, it breaks here. So do you realize now that it is actually an axonal level injury, but it happens in the brain in a diffuse manner? What does it mean? It means that out of the million neurons in the brain, a few thousand neurons are going to break off. Naturally, if so many neurons have broken off, the patient is going to be unconscious, patient is going to have altered sensorium. Now let us look at the clinical and radiological aspects. This was also a recently asked question in one of the FMG exams. Now, if you look at the clinical aspects, now see, because so many axons have broken, the patient is expected to have altered sensorium. Patient is expected to have altered sensorium. But tell me whether this altered sensorium, this break, whether this altered sensorium will improve over time or worsen. Now look at this. What is the underlying cause? The underlying cause is the axonal level break. Tell me whether this break is temporary or permanent. Right, it is permanent, right? The neuron is not going to get stuck with Fevicol or Fevikwik and start working again, no. And therefore, with time, the patient's sensorium does not improve. So that gives rise to what? Your non-improving altered sensorium. Right now, clinically, when you see non-improving altered sensorium and you do imaging, remember this is just a cellular level break, and therefore the early non-contrast CT which is done in case of trauma is absolutely normal. So non-improving altered sensorium in a head injury patient with normal early CT scan suggests diffuse axonal injury. So how is it diagnosed? What happens is that as time passes, at the site of this break there is a small petechial hemorrhage which develops. The way to clinch the diagnosis of diffuse axonal injury is to identify this small petechial hemorrhage. How to identify it is by doing a modality which is MRI, which has a very high contrast resolution, very high spatial resolution. Special sequences are used. These are called as blood sensitive sequences. So what are the blood sensitive sequences? In MRI, these are two sequences. One is called gradient echo or GRE, and the other such blood sensitive sequence is called susceptibility weighted imaging. So on gradient echo or susceptibility weighted imaging, we see black spots within the brain parenchyma. These are called as areas of blooming. So these are called as areas of blooming because these are tiny petechial hemorrhages. Such small petechial hemorrhages can also be picked up by these blood sensitive sequences on MRI. So let us look at a few imaging findings. In one patient, we did a delayed CT scan, and on this CT scan we could see small hyperdense bleeds mainly at the gray-white matter junctions scattered throughout the lung fields. This CT scan was done around 5 days after the episode of road traffic accident, and this revealed such petechial hemorrhages. Better though, as I said, is MRI, blood sensitive sequences, gradient echo and susceptibility weighted imaging. What are the sites of blooming? Where do you see these petechial hemorrhages? The most common site of bleeding or petechial hemorrhages is the gray-white matter junction. So this is the most common site because this is the site of break. Cell body lies in the gray matter, right? The neurofilament or axon lies in the white matter, the junction at which there is a break. So at gray white matter junction there will be a petechial hemorrhage. Next commonest site for such petechial hemorrhage is the corpus callosum. The next commonest site is the dorsolateral brainstem. It is the dorsolateral brainstem. So look at this particular MRI. Can you see these black spots? These are called as blooming, I just told you. So multiple areas of blooming, mainly at gray white matter junctions, as you can see there. These are all suggestive of petechial hemorrhages seen in diffuse axonal injury. So in this case, this is a history clincher. The answer is going to be diffuse axonal injury. Yes, a 40-year-old male is suffering from increasing difficulty in bending forward with increasing stiffness of the spine, reduced chest movements. A CT was performed and is shown below. So this is a reconstructed sagittal CT scan image. What is the diagnosis? Now, if you see here, this is again a spine-related spotter, right? There is calcification of the anterior longitudinal ligament. There is, bridging syndesmophytes. It appears as if the entire spine has been fusioned together like I'm going to give you a clue here, like a bamboo, and this is called as a bamboo spine, which is seen in what? Which is seen in ankylosing spondylitis. Let us discuss this particular spine spotter, this important condition, in a very concise way. Remember, what is the underlying pathology which is occurring in ankylosing spondylitis? The underlying event which is classical of ankylosing spondylitis is what is called as enthesitis. It is inflammation of the enthesis. What is the meaning of enthesis? Look at this image here. An enthesis is a site where a ligament or a tendon attaches to the bone. So it is at this site that the inflammation actually begins. One of the earliest features of ankylosing spondylitis is sacroiliitis. The investigation of choice for detection of sacroiliitis is going to be MRI. This is a coronal stir sequence of MRI. Look at the yellow arrows. This is the sacrum, this is the ilium, so this is the SI joint, right? And at the SI joint, all this bright signal that you are able to see suggests inflammation or sacroiliitis. MRI can detect it earliest. Then the vertebral column is involved. In the early stages, there is sclerosis of the vertebral corner. This is called as shiny corner sign. When there is an erosion which develops at the vertebral corner, this is given a name. This erosion, when it occurs, this leads to a finding which is called as a Romanus. When there is an erosion, it is called as a Romanus lesion. The shape of the vertebral body changes from a normal shape, it becomes squared off. So squaring off of vertebra is also seen. Eventually, as a result of calcification of the peripheral fibers of the annulus fibrosus and bridging syndesmophytes, it gives rise to a fused spine or bamboo spine or poker spine. This spine is highly fragile and therefore it can get fractured, right? And these fractures are through and through fractures involving all the three columns of the spine. Such fractures are given a name. What is it called as? It is called as carrot stick fractures. These are called carrot stick fractures. These fractures don't heal well, and so what happens at the site of these particular fractures, what happens is that there is a pseudo arthrosis which develops, and this is also given a name. It is what is called as the Anderson's lesions. Anderson's lesion is the pseudoarthrosis developing at the site of a carrot stick fracture of the vertebral column. Now, very classical named signs have been given depending upon what ligaments get calcified in ankylosing spondylitis. So when you look at a vertebral, radiograph AP view, you can see these pedicles, right? So here, these are the pedicles. You can see the spinous process here. You can see the transverse processes on either sides. Now, when the interspinous ligament gets calcified, this is given a name. This is what is called as the dagger sign. This is called as the dagger sign, as if a dagger has been put in there. Now, when only the paraspinous ligaments gets calcified, this is what is called as the tram track sign. Right, so only interspinous ligament gets calcified is dagger sign. Only paraspinous ligament gets calcified, it is called as tram track sign. When both of them gets calcified, so interspinous as well as bilateral paraspinous ligaments gets calcified, this is what is called as the trolley track sign. So this is what is called as the trolley track sign. So these are, a wide spectrum of all the important named signs and appearances you must know about ankylosing spondylitis. This is your examiner's favorite. So here the answer is ankylosing spondylitis. It cannot be rheumatoid arthritis. Spine is not so commonly involved in RA, not reters also. Fluorosis, in fluorosis, the overall bone density must increase. So there is diffuse osteosclerosis in fluorosis, right? So diffusely increased bone density should be seen in fluorosis. It is not seen here, and therefore this is not fluorosis, this is ankylosing spondylitis. Yes, a spine related spotter was also asked in your previous aims, right? So they said a 45-year-old male presented with backache since 20 years, difficulty during neck movements. What is the most likely diagnosis? A cervical spine radiograph shows not bridging syndesmophytes but excessive hyperostosis or new bone formation involving close to around 4 vertebral columns, contiguous 4 or greater than 4 vertebral segments. This is diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. This appearance is called as the flowing wax or molten candle wax kind of an hyperostosis. So this is DISH or diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. This was asked in your previous AIIMS exam. In one of the AIIMS exam, a few years back, there was another spine spotter which was asked. See, middle-aged woman with a history of backache underwent a Schober's test. Schober's test is a non-specific test for the elasticity of the vertebral column. It can be positive in a wide spectrum of conditions, not just ankylosing spondylitis. She had hyperpigmented nose and ears. So this is a clue that the examiner has given you. Hyperpigmented nose and ears. Look at this radiograph. What is atypical of these radiographs is that the intervertebral disc is appearing more dense. Can you see that? The disc is cartilage, so it should appear more black or lucent. Here the disc is appearing dense because it gets calcified, right? Chondrocalcinosis occurs. This is seen in alkaptonuria. The musculoskeletal manifestations of alkaptonuria is given a name, and what is it called as? It is called as ochronosis. So this is what is called as ochronosis, calcification of the intervertebral disc. Yes, so look at this radiograph. This radiograph shown below is done for the better assessment of the frontal sinus. What is the common name of this view, right? So this is more or less a straightforward question. Let us look at the important, projections which are done for evaluation of the paranasal sinuses. So the first one is what is called as the Caldwell's view. And in Caldwell's view, if you look at the position here, the patient is asked to touch his forehead and nose to the X-ray film like this. An X-ray beam is directed caudally like this by around 20 degrees, 20 to 25 degrees, right? And this is what is called as the Caldwell's view. It is best for visualization of the frontal air cells, because on the maxillary air cells, can you see this line? What is this? This is nothing but the petrous ridge which is overlapping. But the commonest, one of the commonest sinuses which is involved in sinusitis is the maxillary one. So you want to visualize the maxillary sinuses, you do a Waters view. See how the position is different. The patient is asked to touch his nose and chin to the X-ray film, right? A horizontal X-ray beam is used, no caudal angulation, and the maxillary sinuses are well visualized. This can be done in an open as well, when the sphenoid sinus can be seen through the open mouth, right? So this is what is called as the maxillary sinus view or the Waters view. On a Waters view, 3 important lines have to be assessed. Look at these, I have labeled them. The first line is the inferior orbital ridge. This is called as the lazy W line. So as because of its shape, it is called as the lazy W line. This is the inferior orbital ridge. Next is, I want you to try and see an elephant there on both sides. So the zygomatic arch and zygomatic process gives rise to the head and the trunk of the elephant like this. So this is the head and trunk of the elephant like this, right, on both sides. So this is the zygomatic arch and zygomatic process. And the third line runs along the lateral wall of the maxillary sinus. This is going to form the neck and leg of the elephant. So the neck and leg of the elephant, this is the lateral wall of the maxillary sinus, right, which is seen. So these are the 3 lines. If we draw these 3 lines to look for integrity, it will help us detect some fractures if they are visible. So this is what is the Waters view. So in this particular radiograph, this radiograph shown below is, because if you see in this radiograph on the maxillary sinuses, you can see the petrous ridge which is overlapping, and therefore they have given you a clue. This is a view done for visualization of frontal sinus. So what is this? This is going to be the Caldwell's view. That is the answer, a fairly straightforward question. Now let us look at this particular question. A middle-aged man presents with progressive difficulty in swallowing for both solids and liquids for 8 months. Barium swallow is done and is shown here. What other investigations are to be done in this particular patient? Before we jump to the various options, let us have a close look at this particular image. Now what do you see in this particular image? So if you see here, there is a barium column in the distal esophagus. The distal esophagus appears to be dilated. If you look at the distal end of the esophagus, you would realize that there is a smooth elongated tapering involving the distal end of the esophagus. There is no mucosal irregularity, there is no filling defect which is visible here, right? An elongated smooth tapering is seen at the level of the lower esophageal sphincter, and a very tiny stream of contrast or barium is passing into the stomach, right? So based on these provisional findings, I can see that there is a smooth elongated narrowing at the distal end of the esophagus at the lower esophageal sphincter, no mucosal irregularity, no filling defect, no abrupt narrowing or shouldering which is seen, right? In a middle-aged man, all these findings are very likely to be suggestive of achalasia cardia. Now if we try to compare, because there were some features which were mentioned in the question as history, let us compare the features of achalasia and CA esophagus. What is the earliest clinical feature in case of achalasia? The earliest clinical feature that is seen in achalasia is usually regurgitation, remember, right? Whereas in CA esophagus, the earliest clinical feature which is seen is basically dysphagia. Yes. Right. Now, dysphagia for solids or liquids, there is a slight variation in the history when you look at achalasia and CA esophagus. In achalasia cardia, in the early stages, there is dysphagia more to liquids as compared to solids, whereas in CA esophagus, the dysphagia is more to solids than liquids, right? In this particular case, in this particular question, right, the examiner had mentioned dysphagia to both solids and liquids, right? On barium swallow, as we saw, there is a smooth elongated tapering at the lower esophageal sphincter, no mucosal irregularity, no filling defect. A named appearance which is given to this particular appearance is what is called as the bird's beak sign, right? Whereas in CA esophagus, right, whatever findings we have excluded in the previous image, that is mucosal irregularity is usually seen, filling defects are usually seen, abrupt narrowing is seen. This abrupt narrowing, followed by a narrowed lumen is what gives rise to what is called as the rat tail appearance. Rat tail appearance on barium swallow in carcinoma esophagus. Now, definitive diagnosis, how to definitively, so barium swallow may suggest a diagnosis, but how to confirm your diagnosis? In achalasia cardia, usually a manometry is considered to be confirmatory, whereas in CA esophagus there has to be an upper GI endoscopy followed by biopsy of the mass which is to be done. All right, so in this particular image, so this is a very brief, this is a very concise comparison between the various features, clinical as well as radiological and diagnostics steps as far as achalasia and CA esophagus is concerned. So in this particular case, because we have looked at this image, right, there is an ambiguity because the dysphagia here is both for solids and liquids. We don't know how it exactly started, but looking at the imaging findings here in this particular image, this is what is the bird's beak appearance, a smooth elongated tapering, and hence we are suspecting this is more in favor of achalasia, and therefore the best thing to do here is going to be an upper GI endoscopy and manometry. That is going to be the answer in this particular question. Yes. Now look at this particular CT scan. A 40-year-old male patient with a mucopurulent cough underwent a CT examination. What is the most likely diagnosis? So the examiner has given you a history. See, whenever the examiner gives you a history, the examiner is trying to help you. He is actually giving you a clue, and that is some clue that you must immediately jump upon, you must immediately pick up. So what is that clue that the examiner is giving you here? The clue that the examiner has given you here is that there is a history of mucopurulent cough, right? So the patient has purulent cough, suggests some kind of a chronic condition within the lungs. If you look at the image here, you can see in this particular CT scan that there are multiple dilated cystic spaces which are seen scattered throughout the lung. If you look at the wall, can these be lung cysts? Right? No, because if you look at the wall of these particular cysts, they have a very thick white wall there. Can you see that? When you see dilated air-filled cystic spaces within the lungs with thick walls like this, it means that what you are looking at are in fact dilated bronchi, right? So dilated bronchi, irreversible dilatation of the bronchi is known as bronchiectasis. Very commonly there is superimposed secondary infection in these bronchiectatic areas, so therefore the patient is going to have mucopurulent cough, right? In such particular patient, if there is a signs of acute infection, you may actually see air fluid levels within the dilated bronchi. So in this particular case, in view of these particular findings, the answer here is going to be bronchiectasis. Right now, bronchiectasis, as we just discussed, is what? It is an irreversible dilatation of the bronchi. Now this gives rise to a lot of varied appearances. Now as you can see in this particular image, the yellow arrows there are pointing to dilated air-filled cystic spaces. I just told you they have a thick wall around it, isn't it? And this helps us distinguish them from routine lung cysts. So when you see a thick wall, these are bronchiectatic foci or bronchiectasis which is there. So this cluster of bronchiectatic areas there, where you can see a lot of bronchi which are irreversibly dilated and clustered together, gives rise to a named appearance, and this is what is called as the cluster of grapes appearance. Cluster of grapes appearance. Now sometimes what happens is that if you look at these dilated bronchi longitudinally like this, the two walls of the dilated bronchi appear parallel to one another. This is what is called as the tram track appearance. This is called as the tram track appearance or tram track sign of bronchiectasis. Now normally if you see in a lung field, you can see that there is a blood vessel which appears white and there is a bronchus which appears black. Side by side, they are usually similar in size. What happens in bronchiectasis? The bronchus is going to get dilated. So this gives rise to an appearance like this. So you see the blood vessel like this, but adjacent to the blood vessel, you see a dilated bronchus. This appearance is given a name. This is what is called as the signet ring appearance or signet ring sign, which is seen in bronchiectasis. So a lot of named signs and appearances have also been seen. Remember, if there is superimposed secondary infection, you may see air fluid levels within these bronchi. Sometimes if the bronchi are entirely filled with fluid contents or mucus, then it gives rise to a bronchocele formation. This gives rise to another appearance which is called as the gloved finger appearance. So this is called as the gloved finger appearance is actually seen in bronchoceles when the bronchi are completely filled up with mucus. Yes, so in this case, as we have just discussed, the answer is going to be bronchiectasis. It cannot be sarcoidosis because at your level you must remember what is the most peculiar feature of sarcoidosis. It is going to be bilateral hilar lymphadenopathy, which is not a feature in this particular image as well as history. It cannot be hydatid cyst because usually in hydatid cysts you see a single large cyst with some contents inside, either the floating membranes or debris or hydatid sand. Various named appearances like floating water lily sign have been described in hydatid cyst. Can it be cystic fibrosis? Cystic fibrosis is known to cause bronchiectasis, right? But in cystic fibrosis, remember, the bronchiectasis is usually central bronchiectasis, all right, and not such focal clumped bronchiectasis scattered throughout the lung fields. And therefore, in this particular case, the best answer in this particular question, the best answer is going to be bronchiectasis. Yes. Now look at this multiple completion type of a question. Which of the following investigations can be used in osteoporosis? Right? DEXA. What is DEXA? It is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. QCT. What is this QCT? We have not read much about QCT, but QCT, remember, stands for quantitative CT. QCT stands for quantitative CT, right? Bone scan, chemical analysis. Now remember, DEXA is actually the commonest investigation which is done for bone mineral density estimation. It is in fact today the investigation of choice for bone mineral density estimation. Can QCT be done? QCT is theoretically even more accurate than a DEXA scan, right? But because the cost and the radiation exposure is more, it is not very commonly done. Is a bone scan done in case of osteoporosis? Right, the answer is no. A bone scan, which is a technetium labeled methyl diphosphonate bone scan, is usually done to detect focal skeletal lesions like skeletal metastasis. It may be done to look for certain metabolic disorders like hyperparathyroidism, and a few other conditions in bone tumors as well, bone metastasis. But for osteoporosis, bone scan, that is an MDP labeled technetium bone scan, is not used. Chemical analysis, when you're looking or when you're evaluating a case of severe osteoporosis, you try to look whether what is the cause for the underlying osteoporosis, right? Whether it is age related osteoporosis, which is seen in say elderly postmenopausal women, whether you are able to find out any objective cause as to why the density of the bones has decreased, and therefore in such cases chemical analysis in the form of say serum calcium, in the form of serum phosphorus, in the form of say alkaline phosphatase, right, vitamin D levels, right? So all these blood investigations or chemical analysis comes in handy, and therefore out of 1, 2, 3 and 4, it is 3, that is bone scan, which is not done. And therefore what is going to be done? 1 DEXA, 2 QCT, and 4 chemical analysis is done. And therefore the answer to this question is the last option, 1, 2 and 4. Bone scan is of no use in evaluation of a case of osteoporosis. Yes. Now look at this particular question. A 40-year-old man presents to the ER with severe abdominal pain. On examination, his heart rate is 110, blood pressure, so he's tachy, he's having tachycardia, right? He is hypotensive. There's carding which is present on per abdomen examination. Erect abdomen X-ray shown. Which of the following? How would you proceed in the management of this case? Now see here a very, very straightforward diagnosis. Believe me, in every exam, AIIMS exam or JIPMER exam which has been conducted over over the past 2 to 3 years, there always has been a question either on intestinal obstruction or perforation, that is pneumoperitoneum. If you have seen the We Are With You discussion session that we conducted after the June AIIMS exam this year, there was a question on intestinal obstruction. We discussed how to distinguish between small bowel versus large bowel obstructions and the various features. So this time there was a question on pneumoperitoneum or perforation. How? Why? If you watch carefully here, just look below the domes of diaphragm, right? You can see free air here, right? Especially under the right hemidiaphragm, because the liver is there, which is a soft tissue structure below it, dome of diaphragm above, and between them you can see a lucency there. That is nothing but free air within the peritoneal cavity. Pneumoperitoneum means that the patient has perforative peritonitis. Then you look at the clinical state of this patient. See, the patient is already having tachycardia, patient is hypotensive, right? The BP is dropping, and therefore the first thing that you need to do in this particular patient is to give him some IV fluids, right? The BP is dropping rapidly, right? We don't want that to aggravate further. And then of course you need to identify the cause as to why there is pneumoperitoneum, which part of the bowel is perforated. A CT scan may be done if the patient is normotensive, but usually it also cannot identify the exact cause of exact site of perforation rather. And therefore once a diagnosis of pneumoperitoneum has been established, the next thing to do is to explore the patient, do an exploratory laparotomy. That is how you will be able to identify the site of perforation, if possible do a resection, anastomosis, right? And therefore given the emergency presentation, given the hemodynamic unstable state of this particular patient, the best thing to do here is give IV fluids and do an exploratory laparotomy. So 2 and 3. So the answer in this particular case or in this particular question is going to be A. USG abdomen will not help. Air is the enemy of ultrasound. USG will not help you identify the site of perforation. It may help you see air in the peritoneal cavity, but again USG is not very sensitive for detection of air. Elective surgery is not the choice because the patient is already hypotensive, so you have to do an emergency exploratory laparotomy. Conservative management is absolutely out of question here. So remember, now before we go ahead, jump to the next question, very important topic, right? Pneumoperitoneum. Let us revise a few important specifics about pneumoperitoneum. Tell me, for minimal pneumoperitoneum, what is the best or most sensitive radiograph? The most or best, most sensitive or best radiograph for detection of minimal pneumoperitoneum is not erect abdomen, but it is an erect chest radiograph. Remember, an erect chest radiograph is better, right, than an erect abdomen radiograph for detection of pneumoperitoneum or minimal pneumoperitoneum. However, if they ask you for minimal pneumoperitoneum, what is the best overall investigation or investigation of choice, then it is no doubt going to be CT scan. Remember it this way, we have discussed this when we discussed FAST, isn't it? We discussed that fluid is the friend of ultrasound, air is the enemy of ultrasound. So wherever in the body you want to detect minimal quantities of fluid, what will you do? You'll do an ultrasound, because we know fluid is friend of ultrasound, right? But now if they ask you anywhere in the body you want to detect minimal quantities of air, will you be able to use ultrasound? No, because we know air is the enemy of ultrasound, and therefore wherever they ask you what investigation to do to detect minimal quantities of air anywhere in the body, the answer is going to be CT scan. Remember, so investigation of choice for detection of minimal pneumoperitoneum is CT scan. Investigation of choice for detection of minimal pneumothorax is also CT scan. Minimal pneumomediastinum is also CT scan. So minimal fluid anywhere in the body, you should do ultrasound. Minimal air you want to detect anywhere in the body, you should do a CT scan. So remember these important concepts. Now friends, if I take you back, say a few days, maybe a few weeks, just the 1 week prior to your INI-CT exam, right? You were in your full momentum of preparation, right? And I'm sure each one of us in that last 1 week would have prayed, we would have had a wish as to, if I could just have, say, 1 week's extra time to study, if I would just have, say, 10 days or 2 weeks, 15 days of extra time to study, I would do this, I would do that, I could turn around my entire preparation, I could achieve this and that. Believe me, right, all your prayers have been answered, right? Somehow out of magic, right, there has been a blessing that has been bestowed upon you. And what is that? It is that the NEET PG entrance exam has actually been postponed. INI-CET is done, right? We have discussed it. Probably you did not get a great rank this time. But what lies next now? You have some time at hand, right? The NEET PG exam has been postponed, and therefore now it is very important to consider what steps you could take in the time that you have with you. And here I am, therefore, I'm going to highlight a strategy that could work out well with you. It is a step-by-step approach, remember, a step-by-step plan as to what to do next. It is going to help you in your preparation as you go ahead. Let us start and try to understand what is this pause strategy. P in pause strategy stands for actually pause. We all know what a pause is, but do you really understand the difference between what is the meaning of pause and what is the meaning of stop? At this point, if I ask you to stop, then it would mean to wind up all your books, keep them in your cupboard, lock it or keep it in a bag and throw it, on one of your lofts and never look at it again. That would be stopping. No, I don't want you to stop at all. This is a very crucial time of your preparation. Rather, I want you to pause. It is irrelevant to say at this stage that I want you to pause, because what I sense when I speak to students is that, especially since that particular letter has leaked out about the NEET PG being postponed, most of us have had a slightly, relaxed, you have, sort of sat back, relaxed, you're sitting back, and, you have slightly lost the momentum at which you're preparing. This has happened with almost all of us, right? Remember, and you are no exception to that. But that is actually a part of this pause strategy. Remember that you had considered this year of preparation as a long marathon, right? You were carefully increasing your speed of preparation, and just when you are in your final sprint, you are suddenly told that your marathon has been extended by the next 4 months again. And therefore, believe me, it is absolutely essential for you to pause. But I said, you should not stop. You should just pause. So what to do, when you have paused your preparation, maybe you have slowed down for the last 8 to 10 days, what to do next is what we are going to discuss. So the next part of the pause strategy is what I call is assess and understand. While you have paused, while you have slowed down, I want you to try and think of all those things that you said, that you promised yourself you would do if you would get that 1-2 days or say 1 week of extra time, right? Think about it. This is actually the most important part of your strategy, and I want you to just jot down. I want you to just, try to recall, and assess what you could do in your time that you have with you, right? So can you, assess your backlogs? I'm sure, what we realized looking at Marrow logs is that every student starts with each subject Marrow videos, with a lot of josh, with a lot of energy, but as you go towards the end videos of any particular subject, I'm sure most of you, have skipped few of the last videos. Those videos which are last in the sequence are not necessarily the least important ones, remember, but all of us always have a shortage of time, and therefore we choose to skip some videos and we jump ahead. So for every subject, I'm sure you're going to have some amount of backlogs. Quickly revisit your backlogs, right? Assess your time. Now, what time you have, ahead of you. Supposedly, say you have your exam in March or April. Supposedly, you say it is the end of March, which means that you have what? You have December, January, Feb, and March for your preparation. I want you to divide this time into a division of 2 plus 2. Last 2 months, right? That is February and March, are going to be reserved for your revision. That is very, very essential, right? The first 2 months is now the time that is actually extra remaining with you, and this is the time that I want you to utilize. Assess your weaknesses. Believe me, all of us who love medicine, right, who would want to take up medicine, they would choose to read medicine related topics more. Those of you who are inherent surgeons, who love surgery as a branch, would take up surgery related topics to read. But believe me, it is exactly the opposite that I want you to do, right? I want you to focus on your weaknesses. Which subject are you afraid of? Which topic are you afraid of? Right? If you could not go through radiology, right, in the year of preparation, now is your time. If you could not go through, a particular topic or a particular subject, either one, because you are short of time, two, because you began late, what subject, what topic are you afraid of? Believe me, I want you to invest some time here and overcome that particular fear, right? This weakness, I want you to convert it into your strength. Right? Understand what toppers did. Believe me, Marrow has come out with such excellent topper interviews. Whom are those topper interviews meant for? It is meant for all of you who are going to prepare actively for the NEET PG entrance exam. Isn't it happen every time that almost every time a video comes on the Marrow app, all students are asking for the notes. Where are the notes of this video? Where are the notes of this video, right? And believe me, Marrow faculties like Dr. Abbas Ali sir has gone one extra step ahead for you. He saw these videos for you and he has actually put out, salient features or notes or concise point-to-point analysis of these toppers interviews. So right there in front of you, you have all the topper interviews and a point-by-point analysis of what their strategies were. These are time-tested, result-oriented, evidence-based, kind of points, because these are your toppers which are there in front of you. Use those strategies. Now, as a part of this particular assess and understand part of the pause strategy, what is it that you should exactly do here? Remember that all the toppers interviews that have been coming out in the last few days have emphasized, the importance on looking at mainly focusing on the question bank, solve grand tests or mock tests regularly, either every week or fortnightly, at least twice a month. Revise mainly from your notes rather than looking at something new or reading something new at this point in time. It is a prudent idea to revise from your notes itself. Believe me, if there is a subject that you have skipped entirely because you did not get enough time, the revision videos that Marrow has put out or your MCQ discussion videos are a very, very concise and a very high yield way of revising things, right? Work on your weaknesses. As I said, I want you to convert your weaknesses into your strengths. That is something which is going to help you a lot. As you turn around your preparation, manage time well. Remember, time is the scarcest resource that you have, right? Though there has been an extension of, say, a few months, you have just 2 months now to cover up whatever you had missed out in this year of preparation, because the last 2 months have to be kept dedicatedly for revision. And therefore, if you if you watched these topper interviews, you must have realized how they had utilized their time when they were in the hospitals working, when they were in their clinics, when they were traveling. They were constantly solving these question banks, tests. They were going through pearls, and that is how they could make the maximum use of their time. After you have paused, you have assessed, you have understood what you are going to do, you need to start, isn't it? Now what I want you to do is that I want you to start slowly. Remember that it is going to be a mini marathon sort of, rather than a sprint. I don't want you to plan out or say sit and study for 12 hours together for the next 1 week or 10 days, such that you get completely fatigued and drained out and you then take around 2 to 3 days of break. You cannot afford to do that, and therefore it would be prudent to consider that you are going to prepare at least for the next 4 months of time. And therefore I want you to start slowly, see how you can go through your schedule, how you can set up your new schedule. Once you're comfortable with it, as you go ahead, maybe in a week's time you can increase your duration a little bit, and that is how you must be at your maximal efficiency, at your maximum momentum, say around 2 to 3 months from now. That is when you're going to start revising. So therefore I want you to start very slowly in a measured manner, and then remember, I want you to execute the last part of the pause strategy. For many of you, I'm sure this is indeed your final chance to crack this particular exam. You've already prepared for a 1 year, or the last 2 years you're preparing. For few of you, who thought this could not be your chance to crack it, just consider as if this is your final chance and give your best shot in whatever time is remaining with you. Give it all you got. Don't doubt yourself right now, believe me, there are so many students who are preparing for these exams. And have you observed, rank 1 Nikhil in INICT is actually a fresher who is doing his internship. I do not wish to take away any credit from Nikhil. In fact, he deserves much greater credit, right? Because he is a fresher, he is an intern, and while doing his internship, he has cracked this particular exam. Believe me, if he can do it, with a little bit of effort, rather a lot of effort on your part in the next coming 2 to 3 months, I want you to do it as well. Who knows, you give your best shot for the next 3 to 4 months and you get a rank, say not necessarily rank 1, isn't it? But you would be happy if you get a rank of 100, 200, 300, 500 in the NEET PG entrance exam is a great rank, absolutely, isn't it? That could change your entire life ahead. I want you to take it up as a challenge and give it your best shot, give it all you got, and let us see what happens, right? So this is the pause strategy of actually pausing, assessing and understanding what you need to do, then starting slowly and then to execute your plan, right, as if it is your final chance, right? This pause strategy is something that I want you to do, what you want you to practice. I hope if you go in a step-by-step manner, if you look at the topper interviews, if you chalk out your strategy well, you will be able to execute it well as well. Believe me, friends, at Marrow, the center of all focus, in whatever activities we plan, whatever efforts we put in, is you, our student. Believe me, Marrow could very well have come out with a, rapid kind of a discussion for these particular exams on the day of the exam or within 12-24 hours of the exam itself. But it would not serve a larger purpose than just, quenching your thirst of adrenaline rush. That's it, right? So we thought to wait it out. Once the results were out, we got topper interviews out for you, so that those of you who did not do very well, could listen to these topper interviews and you could chalk out your strategy, right? And now that we realized that students were slightly laid back because of this NEET PG surprise which was sprung up, we thought we needed to do something to bring you back on track. The first video, Dr. Sakshi ma'am's video was released and then you all loved it. There was a great response. Next, Ranjan Kumar sir's, video went, live. Then, microbiology and a few other videos have gone out. And now we've realized that students have already started looking up to them. They are waiting for the rest of the videos to come. And that, I think, is the success of this particular endeavor, right? We have brought you back on track in your preparation. Right, and I'm sure with all these faculties coming out and reaching out to you, giving their insights, telling you, how to plan, how to prepare for the time that you have at hand, I'm sure if you give a very, very sincere attempt, you may be able to get a great rank in this particular exam. So at this point in time, because our focus is mainly on you, that is our students, I want a few promises from you. I want a promise from you. Promise me you will actually pause and reflect a little bit as to how you're going to prepare ahead. I want you to promise me you would actually make a plan. Promise me you will work on your weaknesses and convert them into your strengths. Promise me you will solve maximum grand tests or mock tests which are going to be there in the upcoming in the coming months. Promise me you're going to start slowly, and then as you go towards the exam, you're going to give your best shot as far as your preparation for this exam is concerned. Believe me, if you can promise me all this, I will promise you on my side, we will be here for you. We are here with you all the way right up to the day of the exam, and we'll try and help you get that dream seat of yours. Thank you very much and all the best.